Hello, my name is AJ Miller. Oh, sorry. My name is AJ Miller, and these are my dad's memoirs from 1968 in Pleiku, Vietnam, as a scout pilot for the 717th Air Cav. Um, this chapter is called My First Taste of Real Combat, um, and it's the Tet Offensive. And I'm just gonna get into it because this one's long. It's a little bit of a long piece. So, first taste of real combat, Tet Offensive. Uh, on the morning of January 3rd, 1968, the Tet Offensive began. I was still a slick driver, and I had been involved in direct combat operations for a couple of months. Slick drivers only did insertions, they weren't really heavily involved in combat. Though our scouts and guns had experienced significant enemy contact, our slicks had not taken significant fire during any of our insertions or extractions. A couple of days before Tet, I had asked Bill Rowe, one of our gun pilots and a very close friend from Philadelphia, to fly with him for a day in his gunship. Of course, then we made the arrangement. Neither of us knew that the morning I would climb into Bill's gunship would be the same morning that the Northern Vietnamese would launch the largest offensive operations of the war, and all of the South, and all of South Vietnam would be under siege. So he was just basically volunteering to go take a day off of the slicks and fly with the scouts. Um, I remember that we had a lot of incoming mortar fire that night, and we spent some uncomfortable hours in our bunker. The aircraft, the aircraft revetment area, I think that's when they go back and get refueled, or not refueled, rearmed and fixed, had been hit. But our troop area was not hit at all. I remember going to the briefing that morning, and it was a mass confusion. With only a hurried explanation of the immediate needs in the field, we were told to launch in support of a fire base under siege west of Pleiku that was about to be overrun. I'm going to slow down. With only a hurried explanation of the immediate needs in the fields, we were told to launch in support of a fire base under siege west of Pleiku that was about to be overrun. We started hearing the reports now flooding in from all over South Vietnam that the Northern Vietnamese had launched a major offensive and that all major cities were under attack. As a slick pilot, I'd been involved in retrieving several caches of weapons, large stashes of rice, transporting high-ranking Northern Vietnamese prisoners, and gathering military intel over the past few weeks. And it all pointed to something major happening, but this was far beyond what we had expected. The Charlie model gunship we were flying that day was called a Hog. That meant it was armed with an M5 system, a 40 millimeter automatic cannon, and a turret on the nose called a chunker. And mounted on each side were the heavy rocket pods with 19 2.75 rockets, 2.75-inch rockets. Of course, we also had our two venerable door gunners with their M60 machine guns. Our wingman had dual miniguns and the smaller rocket pods with 7 rockets on each side. The brass wanted us in the air. So Bill and I hurried to the revetments and his waiting Charlie model. With the gunner and crew chief now manning their door guns, we departed with 3 other gunships and 4 scouts. En route to support the besieged fire base, we flew as a loose formation over Pleiku City, and we couldn't believe our eyes. In the town we saw piles of Northern Vietnamese bodies killed during the night in the siege of the town. There were reports of gun battles in many sections of Pleiku, and fire and smoke was billowing from everywhere. As we flew over at low level, our door gunners opened fire on several targets of opportunity, but we took no hostile fire. The radios were going crazy. Everyone seemed to be engaged with Northern Vietnamese units on the attack. As we cleared west of Pleiku, we were contacted by our hire to divert and head to Kon Tum. We were told Kon Tum airfield was about to be overrun and the town was under siege. We banked and headed north up Highway 14 at low altitude. I was flying in the left seat and Bill in the right. That gave him control of the rockets and required him to fly the aircraft when engaging a target. I controlled the nose-mounted chunker, which meant holding the gun sight in front of your face with both hands, looking through the sight with the piper on the target and squeezing the trigger located on the handle to fire. The sight could be moved. The sight could be moved around and could be pointed in any direction. The gun in the turret would follow the movements, and I could fire down and even behind us if I wanted to. I had released the chunker sight from its cradle and armed the system as soon as we cleared Camp Bonari. Bill had switched the rockets hot, but the drop-down sight locked in the ceiling mount would remain unreleased until he was on the rocket run. Some gun pilots use the ceiling-mounted sight, and others like to punch off a single rocket and mark on the plexiglass with an X where the rocket hit the ground. The door gunners were firing sporadically at opportune targets with their M60s, but we really hadn't engaged anyone yet. 20 minutes later, on the horizon, we could see the smoke bellowing up from Kontum City. The city was on fire. As we got closer, Bill dropped to maybe 50 feet off the ground, and at high speed, with our wingman loosely tucked behind us, we headed in over the outskirts of town, straight toward a tall church steeple in the town center. We immediately took heavy fire from the streets below, and our wingman screamed over the radio as he had taken some hits but was still flying. Our door gunners opened up, and I was simply flabbergasted at the sight. As we flew over the city blocks, on the streets were North Vietnamese soldiers talking to young women. "To the right, over there," Bill yelled to me. He whipped the aircraft into a hard right turn, and I was looking out through the top of the greenhouse, the plexiglass window over the two pilot seats. I could see a group of enemy soldiers hightailing it across this open area, and Bill was going in to engage. He immediately pulled the aircraft into a hard cyclic climb, pressing us all into our seats and making the sight in my hand weigh about 100 pounds. I got him, I yelled to Bill, "Set me up." He kept yelling, "That building, they're making for that building," and I knew exactly what he was talking about. With a dance that only helicopter pilots can explain, he maneuvered the old Charlie model into a graceful left climbing wing over. As the nose passed back through the horizon, rolling out with the building coming nicely into my view, he lowered the nose into a high-angle dive, and we headed straight toward the house. He didn't have to say anything, and I opened up with the chunker. My experience with this weapon was minimal at best, mostly in training during flight school, but I knew how to use it, and somehow the engineers who came up with the gun sight knew how to correct for speed and distance, because when the rounds started hitting the ground, probably 3 to 4 seconds later, they were exploding exactly where I wanted them. I could see several northern Vietnamese soldiers in my sight trying to make it through the door of the building, and the exploding rounds walking straight into them, laying them out right there one after the other. Soon, I was blowing the face off of the building. "Keep going, keep shooting," Bill yelled as he pulled out of the dive and banked hard to the right. I kept firing, moving the sight to my left and down towards the door, keeping the rounds hitting the same area, until I could no longer see the target. Our door gunners opened up with all they had, keeping the enemy's heads down and inflicting severe damage themselves. Our break was well covered by their suppressive fire. "Jesus!" Bill yelled, and the first tracers I had ever seen were gracefully arching across the sky. A second stream, steadier and more concentrated, began riddling one of the other team's gunships. Someone was screaming over the radio about the 12.7 gun into the church steeple. The tracers only stopped when we saw a second gunship roll in, and 2 streams of minigun fire hosed into the steeple. But large round fireballs from the steeple followed immediately, directed at the same aircraft as he broke, and I know he took more than a few hits. "Holy shit," was my private thought as Bill began setting up to engage to the church steeple. We're about to take on a 12.7 millimeter anti-aircraft gun, one of the most effective anti-aircraft weapons ever built by the Russians, and I truly felt a little fear. Finally, I sat there with my chunker sight in my hand, and I said nothing. We watched the other gun team try to set up an effective daisy chain, a maneuver developed by gun pilots to allow one aircraft to roll in and engage the enemy while his teammate climbed to roll in again just as he breaks away. The idea was to keep fire on the enemy and never give him a chance to fire back. The orange tracers, the frantic radio calls, all told me that for the 2 gunships that had taken on the gun at the steeple, it wasn't going so well. We roll in from the south, Bill said on the intercom. "Just keep your chunker rounds hitting that steeple, and I'll try to put some rockets in there too. We got to take that gun out." "Got it," I said. What else could I say? Bill sounded so calm about the whole thing. Keep their heads down on my break, he said to our door gunner. Bill and our wingman briefed each other on the radio, setting up their own daisy chain. But we all knew that taking on that heavy machine gun was going to be risky and maybe lethal. The other team continued engaging, and the tracers would always follow a gun run. The other team continued engaging, and the tracers would always follow a gun run. We could see the church was being decimated by rocket and minigun fire, but the northern Vietnamese weren't about to give up that vantage point. Before I could say anything else, we were on top of a climb and rolling into our first dive. My thought was that they didn't expect us from the south, as there were no tracers being laced towards us. As we rolled level, then nosed over, I put the steeple into my sight. I opened up with the chunker, keeping a steady stream of 40mm shells hurling toward the target, and within seconds, rounds were exploding all over the sides and the roof of the church. Suddenly, my cannon stopped, and whoosh, and the whoosh sound, fuck that up, man. Suddenly, my cannon stopped, and the whoosh sound of our rockets leaving the two pods took over. The interrupter switch that stops the nose turret from firing while rockets are being launched was working. Good idea, because we don't want 40mm rounds hitting our own rockets as they pass the nose of our aircraft. Whoosh, whoosh, whoosh. 2 rockets at a time. Bill kept the aircraft in a coordinated dive, and I watched the entrails of 6 rockets weave toward the steeple. As quickly as my firing stopped, it began again. Chunk, 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 several rounds per second. I bet I should have read that a little quicker. The rocket slammed into the steeple, exploding in 3 pairs. Then my 40mm rounds flashed again, one after the other, blowing wood and debris to the street. The steeple was being blown apart as we broke from our dive. Our gunners let loose, covering our break, and I don't know if anyone could have survived it. As Bill climbed away, chunker rounds were still exploding as I lost sight of the target. But he could see through his right window, our wingman in a steep dive, his miniguns and rockets picking up the obliteration of the steeple. When we got to the top of our climb and we were ready to roll in again, we could see there were no more tracers coming from the steeple. Our wingman then informed us that he was heading to Kontum Airfield for an emergency landing. He had taken several hits earlier, and he may have been hit by the 12.7 as well. We disengaged. We followed our wingman to the airport, where he landed without incident. I believe there were 2 aircraft shot down by that gun that morning, but the gun had been silenced. The rest of the day was a series of engagements and sporadic but frantic exchanging of fire. Calls for support came from all over, and the guns and scouts on station that day divided up their efforts, making gun runs on everything from troops in the open to unseen targets in houses and bunkers. But it was soon obvious that in the Kontum area, the enemy had pretty much been silenced. I remember it was a very long day, with multiple refueling and rearming stops. At one point, we were supporting a unit under attack north of the city, and being low on ammo and fuel, we elected to try for the airfield at Dak Tao. I think that's probably said Dak To. Not sure. As we approached the airfield, it suddenly came under rocket attack, and we could see rounds exploding near the tower. The radio call from the tower was one I'll never forget. Incoming, don't land, abandon the tower. And that was it. We continued our approach, not knowing if the rockets would continue following or not, and they did. We aborted the approach and returned to Kontum to rearm and refuel. It went like that all day. I can only say that there were a lot of frantic calls and many short engagements, and I certainly expended a ton of 40mm rounds. We inflicted a lot of damage on the North Vietnamese that day. Our aircraft was hit several times, including a round that came up through the floor and went through Bill's diary, lying next to his seat, but none of the crew was injured. The next day I was back to flying slicks again, insertions, transportations. And in fact, our blue team was called in to reinforce the defenses at Kontum Airport, and the insertion there was probably the hottest insertion of my time as a slick driver. And though our guys on the ground suffered several casualties during that night, we didn't take a hit, and we lost no aircraft. It was probably only a few days after the Tet Offensive began that I actually volunteered to become one of the scouts. It would be a couple of weeks before I would be checked out and flying my first scout mission, but my life in Vietnam was about to change, as Red 17. So that was his first interaction with real combat. Kind of intense. Of course, when you read it, it's like It's kind of strange. But